Okay, so we're now talking about the Constitutional Convention that was held in 1787. And it was at that book points out that the framers came to Philadelphia to discuss what changes to the Articles of Confederation would be made. And when they got there, there wasn't entirely a consensus about what sort of changes, how many changes, and at what level those changes needed to be made. And so it was an open question about what the eventual document would look like. And the eventual format of the US Constitution, replacing the Articles of Confederation, that decision was reached at the Constitutional Convention. Um, and the only way that you could get to that is to have some significant compromises that were made. And so we're going to emphasize those compromises as a way to think about the major issues that were debated at the Constitutional Convention. The first one that came up was the idea of the Great Compromise. The Great Compromise is also known as the Connecticut Compromise, and in a few moments it'll be pretty straightforward as to why that was called that. But the Virginia Plan was one who we often call the father of the US Constitution, in part because he actually did his homework ahead of time and was prepared to debate things in a way that others at the convention were not. He came with a plan, and it was his plan, the Virginia Plan, that became the foundation of the discussions. And so even if changes were made to the Virginia Plan, the original plan, in many ways, the negotiations started with a position that James Madison brought to the table. We also call James Madison the father of the US Constitution. He took notes during the Constitutional Convention, and so we can refer to those notes to see how people argued the positions that they did. And finally, James Madison was one of the three authors of the Federalist Papers. And we'll talk about the Federalist Papers in a few minutes to get a sense of what that is and what important. Three of those contribute to our recognition of James Madison as the father of the US Constitution. It's one of those things that is generally a good test question to identify who was the dynamics. But the Virginia Plan was one that suggested a pretty significant change to the Arts Confederation. James Madison, significant changes needed to be made, not just on the margins. And so the Virginia Plan said that the legislature was fundamentally flawed under the Arts Confederation, different. And they used Virginia as a model and said, well, here in Virginia, what we have is a bicameral legislature, an upper house and a lower house. The upper house legislation would have to pass both of those houses of the legislature in order for it to become law. And so we said, look, we need legislature. And what another issue that we have under the Articles of Confederation is this whole thing that each state, regardless of population, has the same voting power. What we need to have is the amount of votes that you have is going to be based on the population. So larger states, like Virginia, hence the Virginia Plan, would have more representation in the legislature in both houses, and therefore would be able to influence the legislation more than smaller states like Rhode Island or New Jersey. So New Jersey hears that plan and says, well, that makes absolutely no sense to us because we're going to lose a lot of power. We don't have a huge population. We're not happy with it. So what the New Jersey plan was, they said, no, what we need to do is make some changes to other aspects of the Articles of Confederation, but we're not going to change the legislature. The legislature we have is fine. It's a unicameral legislature where each state has one vote. That seems to make a lot of sense, so that's what we're going to end up doing. That's the plan we think we should do. There might be some other changes we want to do, but what we're going to do is keep the legislature the same so that it's a unicameral legislature, only one house, and that one house is going to have that every state has one representative, regardless of population size. Both sides were pretty dug in on this issue, and some of them threatened to walk out if they didn't get what they wanted. So a compromise needed to happen in order to move forward. And so what came to pass was the Connecticut Compromise. The Connecticut Compromise was made by a state like Connecticut that could see both sides of the issue. Connecticut was a large enough state that there are times when they would side with the larger population states, and there are other times when they would side with the smaller states because their population as to be as big as Virginia's. And so they said, well, maybe what we can do is take aspects of the Virginia Plan, particularly the bicameral nature of the Virginia Plan, and then use that to be able to come up with a compromise. And so what the Connecticut Compromise said is, we're going to have a bicameral legislature. We're going to have two houses, a House of Representatives and a U.S. Senate, and then we're going to have it so that the House of Representatives will have representation based on the population of the state. The U.S. Senate is going to have instead equal representation like we have under the Articles of Confederation. At the end of the day, that's what we have. That's why I can refer to the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate, because that was the compromise that was reached. Those were the actual outcomes we have. So the Connecticut Compromise went through, and so they didn't end the convention before it even started. So then we move on to another compromise that is linked to this, and that's called the Three-Fifths Compromise. The word slave does not appear anywhere in the U.S. Constitution, but slavery matters a lot. There were slave states, 5 slave states at the Constitutional Convention. They were Georgia, you had South Carolina, you had North Carolina, you had Virginia, and at that time you had Maryland. Maryland was a slave state. But they weren't as connected to the idea of slavery. There were ways in which some people believed that they might be convinced to give up slavery. But at the time, they had slaves. There were 5 slave states, and those states cared considerably about maintaining the system of slavery. So any attempt in this national government to change the system of government to make it so that slavery might actually be threatened in any way was something they couldn't agree to. Then, when you had the Connecticut Compromise, the Great Compromise, you brought in the question of population. And so the southern states wanted to count their slaves as part of their population, even though they were considered property, because that would allow them more representation. In part, Virginia was the largest state because they had a lot of slaves. And if they counted as part of the population, then they would have even more representation in the House of Representatives. Each state would have the same representation in the U.S. Senate. So when you have this idea that population mattered, you had to figure out who would count as population. But the slaves were considered property. The southern states didn't want to pay any taxes on them. So back in that time, taxes were not based on any goods. You didn't have sales taxes. Instead, the tax was on how large your population was. And so if the southern states were allowed to count slaves for population purposes, then they would also have to pay taxes on those. But the southern states didn't want to. They said, no, they're property. Remember, we're talking about slaves. So they need to count as population for how big our delegation is in the House of Representatives, but we don't want to pay taxes on them. The northern states that didn't have slaves said, that's a stupid idea, we don't want that. You can import a population, you can bring in more slaves, and that will increase your population. You'll be able to overrun the House of Representatives with all these southern states continue to import slaves. And if you're going to count them for population purposes, you're darn well going to pay taxes on them. You don't care if you call them property, but you need to do that. And so a compromise needed to be reached. And the compromise that was reached is that for every 5 slaves that was held in a particular state, they would count as 3 for population purposes, both in terms of representation in the House of Representatives, but also for taxes that the states would have to pay. And so that's why it's seen as a compromise. Many people often forget this and think about this and say, oh, it's considered 3/5 of a person. That's not it at all. They were slaves. They were not considered to be individuals in the sense of having any liberties. They didn't turn around and say, okay, there are 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, we will protect 6 of those for you because it's 3/5. 60% of 10 is going to be 6. We're not going to do that. The compromise was one that allowed the slave states to stay at the table and for us to have an entire government that would include the slave states and the non-slave states. It is not something that we should necessarily be all that proud of because that compromise led slavery to be part of the Constitution. And in fact, the only way that we could get rid of slavery in the U.S. Constitution is to go outside of that document. There is nothing in the U.S. Constitution that said you can have a civil war. It was a civil war that allowed slavery to be eradicated. And even then, the vestiges of slavery still existed because slavery was allowed to exist for a considerable period of time from 1787 until you had the Civil War, 1861 to 1865. And so you don't want to be confused, certainly on the test and also the larger lesson. It is not that slaves were, it was just a mathematical equation that determined how many seats southern states would be allowed, slave-owning states would be allowed to have in the House of Representatives to pay in taxes to that national government. And so even though many delegates from the northern states, from the non-slave-holding states, were against slavery, and they talked about it passionately and said, our government is going to be cursed because of this, our country is cursed because of it, economically it's a terrible system, morally it's wrong. At the end of the day, they were still agreeing to allow it. The compromise was one that punted on the issue of slavery. And so it's important to recognize that slavery is built into the U.S. Constitution in key and disturbing ways.